Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to the third video in the series of Witchcrafting videos, looking at all the Hexen Circle character buffs. Today we're talking about Fischl. Fischl did not need buffs. Sure, she's getting more and more competition in a lot of her roles, namely Inefa and the Taser teams recently, but she's not a character that was, like, bad. She's not a character that needed to get propped up the same way that a character like Klee, for example. But she was starting to see less and less play, and they decided, you know what? We can't have that. Fischl is the GOAT, so let's make sure she gets brought back properly. And so they gave her a buff. And the buff they gave her is actually pretty big. As a quick reminder, 7 characters related to the Hexen Circle, Sucrose, Fischl, Razor, Mona, Albedo, Klee, and Venti are getting buffed to accompany Durin's release. And on top of the buffs, they're adding a new resonance. All of these witch characters are getting at least part, some of them all, of their new, like, buffed effects, conditionally, if you have at least 2 of them on the team. And in Fischl's case, she only got buffs to teams that use 2 witches. Anyways, when the party includes at least 2 witches, after a nearby party member triggers overloaded, Fischl and active party members have their attack increased by 22.5%. If your party members trigger Electro Charge or Lunar Charge, Fischl and active party members have their EM increased by 90. On top of that, they also made it so that at C6, when you trigger the C6 effect by doing a normal attack that has a coordinated C6 effect, the buffs are doubled. So C6 Fischl is now buffing your on-fielder's attack by 45% in overload teams, buffing your on-fielder's EM by 180 in Taser or Lunar Charge teams. She's also buffing your on-fielder's attack by 45 and EM by 180 in over-vape teams, where your on-fielder's a pyro character that's running vape plus Fischl. For a character that was already pretty meta, this buff is, like, really big. As a little bit of, like, context to get a good idea of how big these buffs are, an attack sans is 46.6. An EM sans is 187. A main stat of attack and EM is about as much as what Fischl is giving with these buffs. And she's not just giving them as a buff to your on-fielder, she's also getting it for herself, which will pretty significantly increase her personal damage. Now, when you look at the teams where Fischl is used right now, in terms of, like, actual good meta teams, she pretty much only sees play in Overload. In terms of teams that are very functional, but aren't quite at the forefront of the meta anymore, there's, I mean, some Taser team kinda, and Aggravate teams. People use Fischl when they don't have Inefa for Flins sometimes as well, but it's really mostly the Overload teams. And so, in most cases, what this is just 45% more attack on both Fischl and your on-fielder. On top of that, the fact that she is a witch will also be fulfilling your requirement to activate witch passives of other characters. So, for example, people that don't want to pull for Durin, if they want to play Klee, well, you need to have another witch with her. And if you don't get Durin, it kind of has to be Fischl, honestly. I mean, like, you have a few options, but it's at the very least, it's one of the things you can do. Also, when it comes to Chauveur's teams, I don't want to talk too much about Durin, but I kind of need to a little bit to provide some context for this. He's a character that does off-field pyro damage and applies pyro. He has 2 forms, a damage form and a support form. In the damage form, he does vape and melt damage. In the support form, he's a shredder that can't shred hydro and cryo, but that can shred everything else. But that means you can use him in overload teams for both pyro overload carries and electro overload carries. And if you do, well, he is a witch. He gets a stronger effect when you have the witch resonance. For the sake of overload teams, he shreds pyro and electro by 20%, and he goes up to 35 if you have the witch resonance. Overall, the Fischl Durin core for overload teams is gonna be pretty strong. Not only because of the buffs that are provided to your team, but also because, well, Fischl is doing a lot of damage now. The fact that you have a shredder that works in overload teams also kind of dilutes the effectiveness / the value of Chauveur's. And from what I've looked at, there are now some non-Chauveur's overload teams that are fairly competitive with the Chauveur's ones. I've calced quite a few teams where if you have C0 Chauveur's, she doesn't make your best team because Durin is now a shredder, and the second source of shred is a lot less valuable than the first one. Overall, though, she's gonna get a lot better. In overload teams, she is not providing as much support-wise as Eonsan does, but unless your carry is, like, really saturated in motion value, unless they're just doing a ton of damage, basically, Fischl will often be competitive with Eonsan, if not better than Eonsan, because of her pretty big personal damage. From what I've looked looked at, the only teams where you're not necessarily too happy replacing Eonsan for Fischl is like Verissa when it comes to overload teams. Pretty much everything else now kind of wants to run Fischl over running Eonsan. Fischl's damage is gonna like range generally in terms of DPS somewhere between like 15 and 45k. Right, there are some teams that get a lot more, some teams that get a lot less. You might notice the 4 digits for the cell count on Excel right now. I've done a lot of calcs up for Durin and for Fischl. So like this is an example of a team, right? Verissa, Fischl, Durin, Chavars, where Fischl doesn't do that much damage because you don't really have the rest of your team focused on either team-wide buffs or buffs that can be snapshot on Fischl. The only thing you can really properly get on Fischl is Chavars' attack buff, and that's kind of it. And so in this team, I had Fischl's DPS at around 16k, right, on the lower end. And then in this team, where you're playing on-field Durin, don't pay too much attention to the Whimsy finale. That's a bit of a scam. But just in terms of Fischl's personal damage, now, not only are we getting better uptime on Fischl, but we're also getting to snapshot Bennett's buff on her. And in a team like that, her damage can go up to around 40k. There's even some teams that go above that. Something I've actually looked at today was burning load teams with burning and overload. And in these teams, Fischl is still at around 40k. Point being, Fischl wasn't starved for buffs. She wasn't in a bad spot, but these buffs are definitely gonna make her the actual best teammate for quite a few carries. On top of that, because she's a 4-star, a lot of people are just gonna get her, and because she's an old 4-star that is on the shop rotation, getting constellations on her isn't too difficult. Plus, we're getting a selector for a Witch 4-star next patch, either Razor, Fischl, or Sucrose. And if you're not going for carry Razor, Sucrose cons don't really matter, so no reason not to go for Fischl, unless you just already have her at C6. Now, the most, like, unfortunate thing about Fischl, I think, is that a lot of her power will only manifest if you go for Durin. And when you look at the other characters that are getting buffed in the Witch buffs, there's Razor, and I guess if you play Razor carry and you don't want to go for Durin, Fischl will be nice. But as much as Razor will now be a pretty solid character, he's still not Maoika, he's still not Skirk, he's still not Verissa, so the only people that are actually going to play it are people that like him enough to do it. And if you look at the rest, Mona, there's not that many teams where you're going to want to do Mona Fischl because Mona isn't enough Hydro for Overvate, so it's going to tend to just be a little difficult to get much value out of the Fischl buffs with Mona. Albedo Fischl is like fine, they're both off-field damage dealers, but because they scale with different stats, it might be difficult to justify putting both of them on your team, on a like cohesive team. It'll work, but it'll be whatever. Klee will like Fischl quite a bit, that's nice, but kind of a similar thing to Razor. She doesn't quite get strong enough to be a character that you should go for, unless she's just a character you like or enjoy playing. And then it's kind of a similar thing for Venti. I'd say outside of Durin teams, the only teams where the Fischl buffs will actually matter in a pretty noticeable way are going to be for people that don't have Inefa for Flins, because you'll be able to do Fischl Sucrose and get your buffs. Now, unfortunately, Fischl Sucrose means you need Ino as your last slot for Flins. So one, you're forced to play Ino, which is not fun. And two, Fischl isn't a healer, Sucrose isn't a healer, Ino isn't a healer. So your Flins is gonna die a lot, unless you're paying a lot of attention. On the same patch, they're releasing Yehuda, who's a character who's like, not necessarily as good as Sucrose, but not that far behind, and in some cases better than Sucrose for Flins teams, and who is a healer, and is not crying. But the thing is, if you're using Yehuda, you can't really use Fischl anymore, unless you're doing Fischl Mona, but I'm not too convinced about that one. It'll work, but it's not necessarily going to be a major upgrade. But yeah, all in all, I'm pretty excited about the Fischl buffs. I do still play Fischl fairly often. Pretty much whenever I play Arlecchino in an overload team, Fischl is my default go-to character, and that's just gonna happen even more. There's honestly not that much to say about the Fischl buffs compared to some of the other characters, because she is currently fairly meta, and she will, with the buffs, be just a bit more meta, but it doesn't really open up any new archetypes. It just makes things a bit better. Yai fans, don't cry. Maybe your turn will come. Maybe we get Inazuma buffs in 2031. All right, just keep your fingers crossed. Yeah, that'll be it for this one. As usual, hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned a thing or two, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.